Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. It is my pleasure to welcome you today to this session of the Asian Evaluation Week. My name is Oscar Garcia. I'm the director of UNDP Independent Evaluation Office. UNDP is the United Nations Development Program, and we are delighted to have you among us today. We will have a very interesting and dynamic session with the participation of colleagues from various international development organizations, including the Global Environment Facility, which will be represented by Yuka Wito, the Director of Independent Evaluation Office at the GEF. We will also have the participation of the International Fund for Agricultural Development, IFAD, represented by the senior team leader, evaluator of adaptation to climate change, and Nancy Kesan. And we will have the participation of UNDP, also by a lead evaluator, David Slattery. All of three of them, together with representatives from national governments from Bangladesh and Tuvalu, will be able to discuss about the role of independent evaluation in providing evidence about one of the global crises of our time. Climate change is a silent killer around the globe, and as such is producing changes in various domains of development, and the international community has gathered together to address these challenges in various international fora, including the Sendai Agreements, the Paris Agreement, and the Sustainable Development Goals, which put sustainability of our planet at the center of the development debate. There are various models using projected emission based on current climate policies suggest that warming will exceed 3 degrees centigrade, raising the prospect of even more catastrophic impacts and more significant adjustments. That is why, regardless the scale of the adjustment that will be required, the impacts of climate change are already unfolding. And evaluation can play a significant role in identifying efficient and effective adaptation pathways. That is precisely what we're going to be speaking about today. Then we will be hearing from panelists of two low-lying coastal nation countries that are at the front line of the climate change adaptation. Those are Bangladesh and Tuvalu. And we are very happy to have with us very distinguished representatives from their government who are spearheading their efforts in adapting to climate change. What is then the role of evaluation to provide the best possible evidence to identify solutions and promote scaling up of those solutions in a need for transformational change? With that, and without further ado, then allow me to invite the Director of the Evaluation Office at the Global Environment Facility, my colleague Yuka Wito, to start the presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, Oscar. Good evening and good morning, good afternoon to all. Yeah, we can go forward in the slides, please. So I'm from the GEF, which is a financial mechanism to the UNFCCC, the Climate Change Convention, and more broadly, a source of environmental funding to the developing countries. The GEF doesn't implement the project it finances. That is done by organizations such as our partners here tonight or today, UNDP, IFAD, and Asian Development Bank. As an environmental fund, we are particularly promote solutions that integrate across sectors, bringing together synergies between natural resources management, biodiversity conservation, forests, land use, climate resilience, chemicals management, and so forth. We also recognize that we cannot solve environmental problems unless we find solutions that benefit the people, especially those on the ground who are vulnerable to the impacts of climate change and environmental degradation. In climate adaptation, the role of the GEF is protecting and enhancing the systems in which it operates, landscapes, watersheds, and cities. Adaptation can, of course, take many shapes. However, here I wanted to highlight that much of adaptation can take place through what is called nature-based solutions. That is, utilizing non-engineering solutions. For instance, instead of building seawalls, it may be better to preserve the coastal mangroves that can provide protection against sea level rise, coastal storms, and storm surges, and at the same time offer other benefits such as water purification and spawning grounds for sea life. So on this slide, I have collected some benefits of nature-based solutions as identified by the Global Commission on Adaptation and the GEF's Scientific and Technical Advisory Panel. We can go on to the next slide. An important role for evaluation, like Oscar has already mentioned, is to identify what works best in a particular situation. The goal, thus, is not just to evaluate whether a project did what it set out to do. No, back, please. Yeah, here. Here is where evaluation scope exceeds that of monitoring or a performance audit. In evaluation, we not only ask whether the project did things right, but whether the project was the right thing to do in the first place. And what can we learn from it for the future? As we face mounting problems such as climate change, we must move beyond isolated projects towards what has been called transformational change. Change that is deep, systemic, and sustainable, that makes a lasting difference on how we do things and impacts an area of significant concern to us. At the GEF, we have developed an evaluation framework that focuses on 4 criteria. The relevance of the intervention, that is it addressing an issue that is truly a priority problem? Depth of change, the scale of change, and its sustainability, to assess whether an intervention is contributing to a transformation. What our evaluations have found is that more often than not, projects focusing only on technical aspects fail the test, whereas more lasting solutions can be found when you address issues related to policies and legal frameworks, to how markets work, that can lead to more permanent changes to how we do things and how societies work. Next, please. Another way how projects and other interventions can make a difference is through scaling up. This can take place through a variety of mechanisms as well, through expanding on pilot activities, through replication of successful approaches, through mainstreaming them into development policies, etc. But again, the point is the same. The goal is to change the way things are done at a broader scale. Next slide, please. All this has implications on how we evaluate. Evaluation must shed its project mentality and think on a larger scale. Evaluations can no longer take the internal logic of a project and just evaluate whether what was foreseen in it took place. Evaluations must move forward, must move towards a systems perspective, because all interventions take place in a broader landscape where they interact with other projects and programs and policies and private sector initiatives and what people do in their daily lives. Some of these work in the same direction as the project, while others work against it. Therefore, an evaluation must pay attention to all these other actors in the landscape, and the evaluation must be open to unintended consequences that the project or program may have. For virtually everything we do has some consequences that we did not think about, and they may be both positive or negative. It is also a mistake to assume that our project or program will have uniformly the same positive impacts on all groups of people living in the project area, or that these groups of people have the same priorities and expectations in the first place. For instance, when we design more drought-resilient agricultural systems, the large commercial farmer and the poor subsistence farmer may have only partially overlapping interests, and our project strategy may benefit one or the other more. When we evaluate the intervention, we must be clear about the synergies and potential trade-offs that there are, so that the project participants can make informed decisions informed by the evaluation. All this requires that the evaluators design their evaluations with an open mind, that they understand the evaluand. And here, studying previous research and studies and previous evaluations often provides a good shortcut. And it requires that we select the evaluation methods that are best suited to answer the evaluation questions at hand. Too often we see evaluators allowing their methods to dictate how their evaluations are designed, rather than starting with what they need to know. It seems safe to say that most evaluations are best served with combining methods that may include both quantitative, including geospatial methods, and qualitative approaches. Thank you. Over to you, back to you, Oscar. I think you are muted.
Thank you very much, Juha. That was indeed very insightful and provide us a broad background for delving into our panel discussion. Let me now invite the next presenter, coming from the International Fund for Agricultural Development, Subrahmanyan Tikesan, Nanti among the friends. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Oscar, for that introduction. May I have my slide, please? While the slide is taking on, let me also introduce IFAD to you. IFAD is a fund for agricultural development. It focuses mainly in the rural areas, focusing on the smallholder farmers, as we call them, the last mile organization. IFAD is known as the last mile organization, looking at the most marginalized, or aims to look at the most marginalized and address their concerns. One of the things that we are going to talk about here is, as Juha pointed out, there are two parts to this. One is understanding what are the challenges. And these challenges are not uniform across different actors. Large-scale farmers, small-scale farmers, medium-scale farmers, those who do not have lands, they all have different ways in which they are affected by climate change. And they have faced different climate threats. And therefore, the responses to address those climate threats also have to be different. So we will be looking at both what the evaluations are giving us in terms of what are the challenges we face in making sure that we understand what the problems are first. This will help the governments then to formulate policies as well as initiatives that will be the best solutions for a range of actors, including for us particularly the most marginalized or the smallholder farmers. How can we develop solutions which address these threats that we have identified to best address their concerns? So there are two parts that evaluations help. Evaluations are one of the sources of this information. Research could be another. First thing is to identify what are the common challenges to make sure that we are adapting to climate change and facing the consequences of climate change well. We are climate resilient. Second part is to address how do we address these challenges and make sure that we have become climate resilient, particularly the smallholders in our case become more climate resilient. So evaluations have information on both, and I'm going to capture some of these things here. This is by no means comprehensive, but we will take a stab at it. So the first problem that we face is being aware of what are the climate threats fully. Now, this could be both the government, the actors, the officials, as well as the beneficiaries or the farmers themselves. All of them may be aware. At this present stage, almost all of us are aware at some level or the other there is a climate threat broadly, but the concrete nature of it and how it is going to affect, what are the trends, what is going to happen in 5 years' time or 10 years' time, what is it doing to us now, how are we, our actions are impacting this climate change. Those kind of details are a bit challenging. Those details, awareness of that vary from country to country, from stakeholders to stakeholders, from farmers to farmers. So that is a challenge that we identify as a number one issue to tackle. Make sure that we are aware of the concrete details, concrete nature of what is that we have to tackle. Second part, once we understand these threats, then we have to change our mindsets to adapt and respond, behave differently to respond to these changes. We may have to move from traditional practices to newer practices. How do we do that? What kind of incentives can be there to persuade us to change our mindsets? That'll be the second part challenge that we face. Third challenge that the evaluations point out to is the technical know-how of what to do once we have understood the threat, once we have understood we have had the mindset to change ourselves. It is necessary for us to know what to do. And the challenge with climate adaptation is that it varies. It varies from context to context. It varies from ecosystems to ecosystems, from agricultural systems to agricultural systems. If you have a crop field, if you have a viticulture, these have different solutions. So depending on the landscapes, depending on the type of agricultural systems, depending on the country, the solutions vary. So it's highly context dependent, unlike mitigation, for instance. So that is another challenge, and what we have limited knowledge of what are the things that work best. So improving this knowledge, technical know-how, evaluations point out, is an important part. Then, once we have understood everything, and once we have understood the solution, then it's still, finances are still needed to remedy the situation. Do the farmers have the resources, financial resources, to adapt to these climate changes, to switch to these climate changes, to respond to these climate changes? And this, finally, we come to the point that in order for them to do that, we have to have a robust financial architecture, rural financial architecture that supports climate adaptation activities, that promotes climate resilience, that makes sure that finances are available to farmers who are interested in pursuing these new technologies to adapt to climate change. So these are the challenges, that broad categories of challenges that we face. Next slide, please. So then the next question is, okay, we identified the challenges, how do we solve them? Again, evaluations, when you look at the range of evaluations, certain messages emerge. Evaluation is not the only channel, I should emphasize. There is ample research that is going on in these areas regarding particular solutions and so on and so forth. They are also another source of information, but evaluations provide a useful and evidence-based information for us to act on. Now, the first thing that, as I mentioned already, we have to recognize that solutions vary. What is best? What works? What doesn't work? How can we do things better? All those things depend on the context. That makes it a real challenge in terms of building a body of knowledge. But given that variability, it is important to recognize that one of the best ways to raise awareness, to create the first challenge we identified was the being aware of what exactly are the challenges. There are a range of techniques that you use, but one of the things that you cannot forget, particularly in the agricultural sector, is the role of extension services. How well they need to be equipped to understand these climate threats and try to position the farmers to be open about new technologies and so on. Second part is to change this mindset and create this awareness. It is important for us to have evidence-based solutions that then informs the technical support, the extension services, and so on and so forth that the government can provide to persuade farmers to switch. So for instance, if we want to pursue conservation agriculture as an instrument of climate adaptation, then we need to know what works in conservation agriculture where. What works in Brazil, what works in Bangladesh may be two different things. One may be supporting large-scale farms, the other may be looking at small-scale farms. We need to be able to identify where the solutions exist, and that brings us to the third point: have platforms of knowledge exchange, peer-to-peer learning. What can Brazil learn from? What can a country in Eastern Europe learn from Mozambique, Bangladesh, and Brazil? These exchanges are important. The other part is the laboratories that we have in the field itself, farmer field schools, which actually in the plots, they test out different technologies and compare it with traditional technologies and try to see what works and what doesn't work. And it demonstrates to the farmers exactly what is happening. These are some of the things that have been tried out in several countries very successfully. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, the extension services are quite important too. The important thing is to recognize our extension services are steeped and equipped to handle traditional agricultural methods facing usual situations. When we address the climate adaptation, when we address the climate threats, when we face future climate threats, it is necessary for us to be aware of a range of technologies, a range of agricultural technologies that need to be aware of and be able to effectively transmit to farmers. And then again, another area in which evaluations point out where governments and policymakers can help is improve the rural financial architecture to provide financing needs, to invest in climate adaptive solutions, to promote climate resilience of farmers. They need the finances to invest in new solutions, and rural financial architecture is an essential part of that. And finally, it is not, as you have pointed out, it's not only just these interventions that we are interested in, but also we have to look at the whole chain of events, how the farmer, after producing this produce, in what ways, when the value chain goes up to the point of consumers, what ways in which the chain events can be built in with climate resilient solutions. If we have to transport the farm goods to a outlet, making sure that the infrastructure is climate resilient, so on and so forth. So that throughout the value chain, we can identify how to strengthen, how to make solutions, or how to find solutions which are climate resilient. And they respond to climate threats, not only of now, but of climate threats that we envisage down the road in 10 years, 5 years, 15 years time. I will skip the next slide and take it, stop here and hand it over to Oscar. We can discuss some of the examples that we have faced, concrete examples, perhaps in a question and answer session. I will stop here. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Nanthi. That was very illustrative to see the challenges and good practices that you have identified through the evaluation for rural development. Let me now turn to our next presenter, David Slattery from the United Nations Development Program. David, you have the floor.
Thank you, Oscar. I'll just go to the next slide, please. So I'm going to talk today to a few of the emerging lessons from an ongoing evaluation of UNDP's support for climate change adaptation that I'm leading with the Independent Evaluation Office of UNDP. So I'm going to sort of talk on the theme of evaluation beyond silos, because this is one of the areas that is the focus of the evaluation. The scope includes, I think, UNDP's portfolio of adaptation projects sourced from finance through environment funds established under the Rio and Paris Conventions. So this is GEF, GCF and adaptation fund projects. But we also looked at how the rest of UNDP's portfolio through other mechanisms is considering climate risk with a particular focus in climate sensitive sectors. Based on this experience of this ongoing evaluation, I thought I'd share 3 lessons I think that complement those of our colleagues, my colleagues, but which are particular to UNDP's mandate and position in the UN development system. So for those of you that are sort of unfamiliar with UNDP, it has perhaps the broadest mandate of the institutions in the UN development system, meaning UNDP typically works across a broad spectrum of climate sensitive areas and levels of government, which makes it an interesting case study of this mainstreaming challenge. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay, so the first lesson is that it's critical that evaluations account in some way for the fact that the adaptation challenge is one that has significant whole of government dimensions. As we all know, climate's affecting a wide range of systems: food, water, human health, environment, infrastructure, etc. This means that the adaptation challenge is one that cuts across and between different levels of government. So there's significant risks of maladaptation arising from uncoordinated action between different parts of this system. So what did we find in the evaluation? Well, first of all, reflecting the fact that whole of government is very difficult to do well, I think we found that there are a few substantive examples of really concerted whole of government responses to the challenge of adaptation. I think governments are still grappling with how to do this well. I think reflecting this, UNDP as a development actor is mostly working within very established grooves of government and works with a relatively limited number of actors within government in most cases. While this is a sort of necessary constraint that UNDP works within, it does raise a number of risks that I think evaluations need to consider. Firstly, that UNDP will, in supporting particular institutions, will reinforce rather than help to break down institutional silos. We know within government there are always rivalries between particular actors. There's a risk that UNDP, or development actors will sort of reinforce those rivalries rather than help to break them down. The other risk is that the impact of the work that development actors do in one domain will be blunted or undermined by actions in another. So there are many, many examples of this occurring. For example, efforts to protect or restore coral reefs from climate pressures are unlikely to be effective if large-scale dredging or land clearing is allowed, which is obviously factors which will continue to accelerate the degradation of these assets. So the implications of this for evaluators is that to counteract these risks, I think we really need to look slightly beyond the boundaries of the scope of the actions being evaluated. I think this is important in helping audiences to understand the context for these actions and the likely scale at which they'll be successful. And it will also, I think, help to reinforce the need for improved coordination in the response to climate risk. Next slide, please. So the second lesson is that it's critical, I think, to look for evaluators to look for the substance behind plans and policies that have been the focus of much of the support of the development community. To put this in context, UNDP has been particularly active in supporting national adaptation policy development, both as a basis for facilitating partners' access to climate finance, but also as a lever for transformational changes that are required to deal with climate risk. What we found in looking at this work is that the support, of course, is valued, and UNDP's role in particular convening stakeholders at different levels was a particular facet or strength of its work. However, there's a tendency, I think, to sort of to claim that through this work that UNDP had been successful in mainstreaming climate change adaptation across government policies. I think, obviously we would all agree this is a critically important task. But I think the framing of this achievement does sort of lead one to question the substance behind it. We know that adaptation is not a one-off challenge. It's one that's long-term, and so it raises slight alarm bells to sort of hear easy declarations of victory along these lines. So the implications, I think, for evaluators is that we really need to look for the substance behind major government policy processes that we support, and to understand the extent to which they're likely to have tangible impacts on the ground. Next slide, please. The third lesson I'd point to is that there's a real need to consider the risk that adaptation will become a siloed work stream, sort of separate from and divorced from our regular development projects. I think this risk arises because the international politics around maintaining climate finance as separate and distinguishable form of development finance rather than a lens through which all development projects are considered. So while adaptation finance, I think, is encouraging, I think, a more explicit focus on climate risk and adaptation requirements, which is important and welcome. I think there is a risk also that it will perpetuate the idea that somehow adaptation is a separate consideration rather than a core part of all development planning. What did we find? UNDP, through these environment conventions, has established a very significant portfolio of climate change adaptation projects and expertise in a range of areas where adaptation is important. However, the current challenge is that this portfolio is currently being managed very much as a silo within the institution, and there's relatively weak engagement between it and other practice areas that are also exposed to climate risks. I think on this basis, we see that we're still making steps to mainstreaming consideration of climate risk across the broad portfolio of development projects that are managed within the institution, and may be reflective of, I think, also what's happening within governments. So the implications for evaluators are that it's likely that for political reasons that vertical funds will continue to require a very clear distinction between adaptation finance and regular development finance. But I think in that context, evaluators can and should play a role in looking to identify opportunities for better integration of climate finance with regular development projects. I think there's also a need, I think, to use the adaptation funds as a vehicle for improving the way that governments across the spectrum of their activities assess and manage climate risk, because this is the nature of the challenge that is facing us. Thank you. Back to you, Oscar.
Thank you very much, David. That was indeed very useful. We have covered with the presentation by Juha Uitto the systemic perspective, really identifying the main risks and having to look at them, that recognizing that there are forces for and against climate change adaptation with intended and unintended consequences, as well as the importance of identifying synergies, but as well trade-offs, because those are important for policymakers. And Nanti has identified various challenges and what do we really know about climate change adaptation, and some of the responses which imply the government services of extension services, as well as more resilient value chains approach. And David, with 3 very interesting lessons learned from evaluations of UNDP, that it's important to go beyond the silos of sectors, including the environmental sector. Now with that, it is really my pleasure to invite 2 government representatives, Ms. Perpetua Latasi, Director of the Department of Climate Change in Tuvalu, as well as Mr. Khan Ferdusur Rahman, Director General Foreign Aided Project Audit Directorate, Controller and Auditor General of Bangladesh, 2 very distinguished panelists who will start by commenting and presenting their own country experience. Please, sir, Mr. Khan, you have the floor.
Hello.
Yes.
Yeah, Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you all. Thank you very much. As Mr. Oscar mentioned, climate change is a silent killer. Perfect. Bangladesh, because of its extreme climate vulnerability, has been quite active in delivering climate actions by putting in place relevant policies and strategies over the last 2 decades. Bangladesh played the role of front runner and took the lead in taking forward many climate agenda, which earned global appreciation. We have climate change strategy and action plan, and we have National Adaptation Program of Action in 2009, and we created Climate Change Trust Fund in 2009 from its own resources to finance the programs set out in Climate Change Strategy and Action Plan. So far, the corpus of the fund is around $430 million. At the same time, Bangladesh Climate Change Resilient Fund, formerly known as the Multi-Donor Trust Fund, was created to pool funds from the development partners. In addition, government launched in 2017 Bangladesh Country Investment Plan for Environment, Forestry and Climate Change, that is from 2016 to 2021. It is a 5-year framework that identifies the areas of investment under environment, forestry, and climate change. And that has submitted to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. That means United Nations FCCC in pursuance of the Paris Agreement, as well as 10 agenda of the United Nations 17 SDGs. In South Asia, Bangladesh was the forerunner to submit intended nationally determined contribution for adaptation and mitigation activities in the context of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Adaptation is included in the key national development plan. That means our strategic plan, 7th 5-year plan, 2016 to 2020. We also working our 8th 5-year plan. Under the related annual development plans, climate change screening tools have been integrated into the development projects proposals. The government also adopted a climate fiscal framework in 2014 and updated in 2020 to provide a roadmap for embedding climate dimension in the country's public financial management system, which is yet another significant step towards linking climate policies and strategies with the resource allocation process. While implementing climate fiscal framework, the government integrated climate change policies and strategies in the budget, setting processes and turned the ministry budget framework, that is MBF, of 25 ministries climate inclusive. And in financial year 2020-21, out of total allocation of these ministries, 7.55% has been allocated to address the vulnerabilities of the climate change, which is 0.8% of our GDP. You know, monitoring and evaluation is essential to achieve the long-term success of climate adaptation initiatives. In many countries like Bangladesh, the practice of monitoring and evaluation is so for purpose of accountability. In terms of climate change adaptation, evaluation plays an important role in supporting strategic and effective planning, as well as providing understanding where to focus, why this is the case, what is working or not, and how to learn from experience to minimize the impact. In Bangladesh, the main efforts to address the adverse effects of the climate change are directed towards the adaptation to strengthen the resilience of the climate vulnerable communities of the country. The government of Bangladesh are making interventions through various programs to improve the climate adaptive livelihood of the people who are living in different ecological zones of the country, like coastal belt, floodplain, drought-prone areas, hill tracts, and low-lying wetlands. Among the communities who suffer from the effects of the climate change include mainly women, elderly citizens, children, disabled persons, ethnic minorities, and plainland and indigenous people. Challenges in climate change adaptation evaluation. This is indeed a critical challenge. You know, I am from Comptroller and Auditor General of Bangladesh. It is indeed a critical challenge for oversight institution of the country, in particular the Supreme Audit Institution of the Office of the Comptroller and Auditor General of Bangladesh, which is mandated to meet the citizen expectation gap by delivering its services to the concerned ministries and department. We conducted now I am trying to talking about integrating climate change in resource allocation process, and our evaluation activities through Comptroller and Auditor General of Bangladesh. Despite the challenges, the Office of the Comptroller and Auditor General of Bangladesh, the Supreme Audit Institution of Bangladesh, which suffered from a project called Inclusive Budgeting and Financing for Climate Resilience, funded by UNDP, has introduced a new audit protocol called Climate Performance Audit as part of the process of strengthening governance to reduce the fiduciary risk in the utilization of the climate finance. And we conducted climate performance audit of 2 projects of the government financed by Bangladesh Climate Change Trust Fund, and another one is Bangladesh Climate Change Resilience Fund on a pilot basis. In addition, the Office of the Comptroller and Auditor General of Bangladesh has put in place 2 documents setting out generic criteria for climate performance audit as well as guidelines for planning climate performance audit, the new audit intervention. Side by side, since there is a challenge of sustaining the results of this intervention in the audit arena, a comprehensive training manual has been developed and tested, which is used by Office of the Comptroller General of Bangladesh Training Unit, that means FIMA, Financial Management Academy, for providing training to the prospective auditors. We conducted our audit following the government auditing standard, performance audit manual of Supreme Audit Institution of Bangladesh, relevant international Supreme Audit Association, and INTOSAI working group on environment audit guidelines to audit the climate change. Our recommendation regarding monitoring and evaluation is, expert opine that by 2015, some 20 million people residing in the coastal areas would become environmental refugees. It is high known that the government and the concerned ministries agencies take proactive and timely measures to solve these problems. By saying this, thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Khan. That was really very informative, and congratulations for all the efforts that you are making in Bangladesh to address the important challenge of climate change in a very government-led and systemic way. It is now my pleasure to invite Mrs. Perpetua Latasi, Director of the Department of Climate Change in Tuvalu. Madam, you have the floor. Do we have her? You may unmute your microphone and turn on your video, Madame Perpetua, please. We may be experimenting some technical problems. Michael, can you unmute her, please? All right, while we wait for the technical glitches to be sorted out, we have four actually very interesting questions from the audience already. The first one is in the relationship between human beings and nature, there is a role for the indigenous knowledge. And the question was directed to IFAD. What is the role then of indigenous knowledge for addressing climate change, particularly when speaking about rural development? I know that on the chat, Nanti Hassan has already responded, but I don't know if you want to expand a bit on what you have already provided through a written response.
Not expand, but in case others haven't got a chance to read my response, I thought that was an excellent question, and I should have addressed that in the presentation itself. The last mile includes indigenous and other marginalized peoples whose voices need to be heard in responding to climate adaptation. And in general, in principle, local knowledge is critical. Climate solutions are not imposed from the top. They won't work. They don't last long if local knowledge and local understanding is not reflected in our solutions. So it is important that local knowledge, either modern or traditional, has to be first heard, and local solutions first listened to. And then we can suggest modifications or elaborations or expansion based on their understanding and their reading of what it is. It is not always the traditional knowledge or even local knowledge will always be fully informed. That doesn't mean that they don't have a role or they should not have a role in there. Our job is to make sure that their knowledge is complete. We fill in the dots, fill in the necessary information they may need. They may not have climate anticipation models predicting what is going to happen in 10 years. We may supplement their knowledge system with that knowledge. And if it were to happen, what will be your response will be the kind of things. So the important part is to understand them fully and adapt our solutions to reflect their own understanding, mindset, and so on and so forth. That is the basis for lasting solutions. So traditional knowledge and local knowledge is very important in making sure that we have our solutions working.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me see if we can now connect Madame Perpetua Latasi from Tuvalu. Madame, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Let me try and get the technology to work.
Sure. Now we can see you and we can hear you clear and loud.
You hear me?
Yes, absolutely. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. And so first of all, thank you for the opportunity to allow me to share with you and everyone who's listening some of the views in relation to the topic that we are now discussing, particularly from a small low-lying atoll in the Pacific region, so from Tuvalu. Tuvalu being at the forefront of climate change, and I've been experiencing it firsthand, the impacts of climate change that we're facing all over the globe. We seem to bear the burden of the impacts that we are facing. So a lot of adaptation work have resulted or being undertaken in order for us to adapt to those changes. Although over the years we have done a lot of adaptation measures to help us adapt to the impact, we also then recognize the need to look at how effective are those measures. Are those adaptation measures have built into the adaptive capacity of individuals and systems and ecosystems in the country. And one of the, so as part of looking at the, part of our previous projects, interventions, adaptation interventions, looking at evaluation of adaptation, it seems a lot have learned over those years. And some of the criteria that were presented before by our speakers, looking at the relevance of those adaptation measures that have been undertaken, and also the depth of that change, or what effectiveness have been brought forward for, and what sort of scale of change we have looked at, and the sustainability of those measures once dedicated funding have been have run out. So for instance, we have specific projects from the Global Environment Facility. We have projects or adaptation projects being funded from our bilateral donors, as well as the Green Climate Fund. So over the years, as we completed those adaptation measures, there are evaluations that have been undertaken to see how have those measures provided benefits, or what are the benefits that have come with. So from what we have seen so far is that in a small island state situation, there are challenges. First of all, looking at if we are evaluating the whole processes of adaptation, it should take into consideration how the intervention or the project have impact, or what impact have driven on actors that have involved. Actors means those that individuals or organizations that have taken part in delivering those adaptation measures, let alone there are beneficiaries. So those who are involved in delivering the adaptation measures and those who have benefited from those adaptation areas. And then the next part of it is looking at, part of the evaluation is looking at what processes and systems that have been created or strengthened during that process. Because some of the systems and our processes have only put in place when we were implementing those adaptation measures. So that also required to be evaluated proper and see how relevant are those systems that have put in place. The next part of it is looking at laws and policies. How have adaptation intervention influence or contributed to the formulation of legislation and policy in the country, and how has those adaptation measures help us frame our policies and our laws. So that's also a critical part of evaluation to be considered. And then lastly, looking at the institutions. In the institutions that have been established, or the institutions that have been strengthened as part of those adaptations measures being undertaken in the country. So it's then based on those four sectors that I have, or 4 areas that I have identified. We then look at what are the challenges and what are the solutions, as some of you have mentioned earlier. Looking at identifying solutions, how those have, those identification or those information coming out of the evaluation have helped us scale up those actions. So if it's effective, in terms of the effectiveness of the measure being undertaken, the evaluation process really helped us to identify those and also identify how best to scale up. And that leads to transformational change in the long run. So those are some of the critical issues that we have gathered over the years that we have been doing adaptation. And some of I wanted to highlight two quick examples of adaptation measures that we have undertaken, one in the agriculture sector and one in the water sector. Because I noticed there was a presentation earlier specific on the agriculture sector. So in the agriculture sector, because of sea level rise, farmers in the communities were not able to plant their crops their root crops that need, because of sea level rise, there is saltwater intrusion to agricultural land. So one of the adaptation that we financed from the LDCF, the Least Developed Countries Fund, as part of our NAPA, National Adaptation Program of Action, was to develop or was to construct concrete or cement structures. So instead of planting in the ground, we are planting now in concrete or cement structures. And the measure was very effective because during a cyclone, we have storm surges, and all the, from storm surges, the natural agriculture land were inundated by seawater. Whereas those structures, because it was built on top of the land, because the natural one, you have to dig underneath the ground so that you get much more closer to the groundwater for the root crops. The new structure that we put in place as part of adaptation was built on top of the ground. So when storm surges occurred during cyclones, these were survived. Like the waves was not able to overtop over those cement structure. So the families and communities were able to maintain their food source during this time of cyclones. So that's one of the successful adaptation measures, and now it's being in the process of scaling up and also replicating to other parts of the communities in Tuvalu because of the successful and effectiveness that we have received from those measures. I don't know in terms of timing, how am I doing with timing, but I wanted to stop there for now at this time. And thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Madam. Those examples were really very useful to seize the opportunities that you have done and identified in Tuvalu with the adaptive capacity of the country, and really asking what is the impact on the actors, and therefore establishing the institutional framework and legislative framework to act upon, with two excellent examples. With that, let me now turn to the question and answer session. We have already answered one of the questions coming from the participants. I would like to address two more questions. One was, how did the interministerial coordination took place? And originally this question was directed to David Slattery. However, I would like to change and ask really our colleague from Bangladesh, Mr. Khan, who can perhaps tell us about his concrete experience of interministerial coordination for climate change adaptation in Bangladesh. The other two questions, one was on the role of governance and to what extent failure to address climate change is a failure of governance, and that perhaps can be responded by David. And another one, if UNDP uses climate risk screening tools for development projects. Perhaps you can address those two questions, David, while Mr. Khan tell us about his intergovernmental experience in Bangladesh. And colleagues around the globe who are participating in this webinar, the floor is open for questions. Please be so kind to use the chat function to pose your question, and Julie will cater them to the panelists. Thank you very much. Over to you, Mr. Khan. You are muted right now.
Thank you. It's beautiful questions. You know, while implementing our cumulative fiscal framework, the government integrated climate change policies and strategies in the budget setting process and turned the ministry budget framework of 25 ministries climate inclusive. And as I said earlier, this financial year, that means 2021, out of our total allocation of these ministries, 7.5% has been allocated to address the vulnerabilities of the climate change, and which is 0.8% of our GDP. The government also produce annually a climate budget report to demonstrate the government's commitment to address the adverse effect of the climate change. Another important purpose of this report is to provide a repository of knowledge on the climate finance to broaden the understanding of the wider stakeholders in Bangladesh so that they can better engage with the contribute to the policy development and monitoring. And you know, Bangladesh wins the Earth Care Award in 2012 for the LDCF adaptation projects. And finally, I am saying that given the scale of climate investment now, we should reach much higher trajectory in near future. There is a need to bring in quality in the evaluation process to make sure that the citizen gets the best value for money and the invested resources ensure their greater welfare. The results of evaluation, when feedback into policy formulation, will inform the policymakers to design effective evaluation of our own adaptation policies and programs. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that illustrative response, which tell us really the seriousness with which you are dealing with this challenge by having a fiscal approach, even for that vegetarian approach that aligns a number of more than 20 ministries. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You are welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much. David, may I pass you the floor then to respond to some of the questions posed by participants.
Thank you, Oscar. I guess at the highest level, there's been a massive failure to address climate risk, which is exposing us to a level of threat going forward that we have not, I think we're unprepared for, and clearly the pathway we're on is an unsustainable one. Part of the problem in dealing with this is the fact that we're also dealing with significant pre-existing levels of maladaptation. We continue to see failures in governance that relate to basic better practices around building standards, effective spatial planning, don't build on floodplains, use the right building techniques, etc. So to some extent, we are playing catch up, both with those existing problems, but also, I think, mentally with the fact that the risk profiles are changing dramatically. And we're seeing with just in the last 5 years, the wildfires in Australia last year, the wildfires in California, the hurricanes in the Caribbean. Each event is an order of magnitude greater than what we've typically experienced in the past. And this is representing, I think, a new normal when it comes to risk that we're still processing in terms of our governance arrangements. I think we can see that in terms of the response within UNDP is that we're also, while we have established screening guidelines and policies and have had them for some time, I think the challenge is ensuring a kind of consistent understanding across our very large country office network and across our staff of what the nature of the risk is. And I, not being a climate person, for example, was surprised in talking to a colleague from Jeff quite recently to hear about the risks or the importance of consideration of risks in the chemical and waste management sphere, which is not one that I would have necessarily instantly thought there is significant climate risk. But of course, when you think that through, the water dimensions of chemical and waste management, of course, are significant. And when we're talking about significant changes in precipitation patterns, obviously that is a sphere where heightened attention is required. So there's still a significant, I think, amount of work to do in working across government, but also within UNDP, in ensuring that there's consistent attention to, I guess, the way that the risk profile is changing and the kind of threats that that will have to the sustainability of the development interventions we are implementing. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, David. And your answer gives me a very good segue to extend the question to Juha and really learn from the GEF, the Global Environment Facility, and see how the GEF has, if it has used a climate risk screening tool for the project that it is financing.
Yeah, thanks. You know, it's actually that's a very good question, and we have actually done very recently an evaluation where we looked at LDCs across the board, and that wasn't only about adaptation, and it was a global evaluation where we looked at what is happening in LDCs with the GEF portfolio. And one of our findings was that the climate screening is not being used very widely. It is used in adaptation projects, obviously, but it is not used systematically in projects in other focal areas, for example, biodiversity or chemicals and waste that David was mentioning just now. And one of our recommendations is that it should be expanded. It should be expanded, and obviously for obvious reasons, also for the reason that, for example, in biodiversity conservation, climate change can actually significantly undermine the project viability and sustainability in the longer run. For example, if you establish a protected area somewhere and the climatic conditions change considerably, so hey, that protected area may no longer be viable.
No, indeed, and therefore this recommendation that you have made to the Global Environment Facility sounds very important to be taken up very seriously by the fund and the facility. Is there? Let me now move to another question from the audience. The question reads as follows: is there any evidence that shows ex-ante evaluation of climate change adaptation project as being effective? Is the question clear? Is there any evidence of an ex-ante evaluation of climate change adaptation that has proved the project to be effective? May I really pose the question to all the panelists and to see who would like to respond? Maybe Nanti?
To my knowledge, we have not conducted any ex-ante evaluations on climate adaptation projects. So an empirical answer is not possible. However, if we were to make an educated guess as to the possible effectiveness of ex-ante climate adaptation projects, a couple of things will be useful to pose and answer, which we have touched upon already. How well is the project based on local knowledge and local information on existing agroecologies and agrotechnologies? That will be a very useful question to start with. The second part of this is also the important part of climate adaptation projects is that, which is usually underrated, is how well the ecosystems are restored or improved or at least maintained as they are while we adapt to climate change. Whatever the responses we do, let's say we pursue conservation agriculture. What is the result on ecosystems? This kind of approach will be necessary to answer a question at the very beginning of the project itself. So I can clearly see that some of the mistakes being addressed already, if we can, at the beginning of the project, ask the correct evaluation questions and make the project design answer those evaluation questions. These two parts, the local knowledge as well as the ecosystems interaction, both are actually interconnected. So I do think that rather than wait until the end of the project to start the project with these questions, which usually project designers may or may not address, because that may not be in their radar screen. It may be in the radar screen of evaluators, but it may not be in the radar screen of the programmers. So in that sense, I would suspect that such an evaluation at the beginning would improve the design and its effectiveness. Over.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your thoughtful reflections on that. It is an interesting question. Please, Johan.
Yeah, just one thing, and this is not particularly related to adaptation, but it is it's related to project screening based on evaluation criteria. And a couple of years ago, we did an evaluation which was kind of a different kind. It wasn't an accountability-focused evaluation, and it wasn't based on a random sample or anything. We asked actually the 18 GEF agencies to nominate projects that they thought were transformational. And we got I don't remember, more than 100 projects nominated by the agencies. And we screened them by our own criteria, and they were all completed projects, and we looked at the terminal evaluations and determined that here is a bunch of projects that are actually, that can claim to be transformational. And then we analyzed them, what are the common features in them. And they had to do with the 4 factors that I mentioned, that that they had actually, deep thought objectives towards transformation, that they were designed for transformation. They were well designed, and they had factors such as critically things like, how do you really transform policies? How do you transform markets? How do you ensure the continuity beyond projects, so sustainability and so on. So you have financial mechanisms, you have institutional mechanisms and so on. So when you use these evaluative criteria that we came up with, kind of empirically looking at truly successful projects, you can come up with criteria which you can use ex ante actually to see that, do these projects that you are, putting forth, do they fulfill these criteria? And you could, of course, do it more specifically towards some adaptation projects. We haven't done that, but these generic criteria are there.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Very useful experience of a different approach, but trying to respond to the same question. In UNDP, we have conducted recently a series of lessons learned of UNDP support to previous crises and how natural resource management was an important way of coming out of the crisis. And one of the lessons that we extracted is how critical the women's participation is in any response to climate change adaptation. That is why I am so delighted that Madame Perpetua is among us. And let me now give her the floor so that she can share also other experiences in terms of this transformative change. And she was hinting at some of those examples before she finished her intervention. So may I invite you to share more of your experience, Madame Latassi, please. Please go ahead.
Hi. It's always a tricky with the internet connection, so I need to turn off my video microphone so that I can hear not dropping off. If I hear your the question clearly, and I think I can read that from the list of questions that are being posed, and it's related to the adequacy of development resources. So I just trying to ensure that I get the right question, and so that I can provide the right response to that. If you don't mind, if you can repeat that, please.
You know, my original question was really expanding on the transformative approach to climate change, and really based on your experience, what has been transformative. And because you were mentioning two examples, one on agriculture, the other one on water, but if you have, you would like to expand on any of them, please be so kind to share your experience with us.
Okay, thank you. Yes, so what we have learned over the years of doing adaptation, and as you may be well aware, based on the situation of the country, we have islands. And the projects or adaptation interventions are mainly like started off in a number of islands, so not a nationwide applicability. So as I mentioned, some of the agriculture example that I have provided, it was only done in one island, and based on the effectiveness of the measure, it has been designed for scale up to include other islands as well, given the effectiveness of the adaptation intervention that we have undertaken. So coming then, based on that, it has created a transformational change in terms of traditional agriculture, in particular for root crops. So the transformational change that we have put together as a result of this adaptation measure is that farmers have moved towards using more of composting, so that they can put into those concrete structures that I was talking about earlier. Because of the natural agriculture sites or soil, it not necessarily required a lot of composting to be done, because of the fertility of the soil, of the natural soil. Now that we are planting in concrete structures, the transformational change that it has brought forward, encouraging organic farming, composting, and all of that. Not only that, it has become part of everyday food source for people. For our root crops, there are specific root crops that are part of our cultural processes, in which those big taro are only harvested at a time when there's big functions. Now with the availability of these structures, which are also more planting very close to household, people have become more, it's changing in their diet, and also the food sources are much more available. So the transformational change that have been occurring, not only like in terms of the institutions or the structures in cultures, but the everyday life of people have been changed,
which is ultimately what we want to achieve.
Adaptation measures. So the adaptive, yeah.
Yes, great. Thank you very much. We have time for one last question, and this is that climate change is a global catastrophe, as Mr. Aladdin Salmai characterizes it. It is also a political issue, especially for developed countries. How the political challenges can be considered in evaluation? Does anybody want to address that question? I see a number of smiles. David?
Well, it has to be, is my response. I mean, evaluation is an inherently political process. So every evaluation encounters politics, whether it's aware of it or not. I guess the challenges for evaluators is to enter into the political fray with kind of wide open eyes and to manage the politics astutely. I think what I'm mostly concerned about is where I see evaluators entering into too much self-censorship rather than asking sort of innocent and open-ended questions. They tend to sort of say, we're not going to ask that question because of the politics. My response to that is, well, if you don't ask that question, then who is going to ask that question? And that's one of the real values of evaluation and roles of evaluation as a profession, is to ask the questions that others can't. Not to say that, you know, that not to say that there's not some nuance and care that's taken in entering into that fray, but we need to.
Thank you. And indeed, as Juha Uitto was mentioning at the beginning of this webinar, we need to take a systemic perspective. And within that systemic perspective, there will be forces for really moving a more sustainable development pathway, which will facilitate an adaptation to the climate change and eventually also a mitigation of the climate change effect, trying to bring the boundaries back to reasonable levels for the planet. And there will be forces against. And as David said, we need to be aware of that as evaluators, that we are operating in a political economy environment. But I think as development organizations, we are really thinking of the benefit for the people, particularly the most vulnerable ones who are seriously and most seriously affected by the effects of climate change. And that happens in all the countries. Nanti has also some words to share with us, please.
No, that is a very interesting and important question. And there is not much we can do. We can't recommend to. Part of the problem is that the people who are bearing the brunt of the climate adaptation costs are not the people who produced the problem. So the source of the problem lies elsewhere and the cost is being transferred to somebody else. The evaluations can highlight the costs that are coming to the smallholders or whoever the beneficiaries are. It is like what we analyze the unintended consequences. It will be useful for us to highlight in our evaluations what is the cost of this climate adaptation effort to the livelihoods and to the well-being of the people that we are trying to support, right? That could be a reminder to others that this cost has nothing to do with their actions. This is a cost that is coming to them because of somebody else's action, and they are going to bear the brunt of it. So at least the least we could do is making sure that that particular calculation is presented in our evaluations. Over.
Thank you.
Oscar, I want to say something in this regard. You know, despite the country is an innocent victim of climate change, it is not receiving adequate resources from the international financing windows, which was committed while drawing up the Paris Agreement in COP21. For example, Bangladesh has so far received a corpus of only $94.7 million from Green Climate Fund, which is not commensurate with the growing requirements of climate investment across the affected ecological zones of the countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much for bringing that country perspective to the debate, which is so important and reinforces the point that Nanti-san was making. Colleagues, we have come to the end of this webinar. Before really closing, my colleague Juha Uitto was also want to have a final word. Is that correct, Juha?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't want to have final word, but I just saw that there is a direct question to GEF, which is uptake of GEF evaluation recommendations by concerned governments in view of the political and business sector sensitivity and so on. Well, it's the same question in some ways, but short answer is that the uptake in the GEF Council in which countries are represented, it's 100%. How they are implemented is a different question, obviously, and that depends quite a lot on what's happening in the country itself, and therefore, as an environmental fund, we often try to move beyond, with due respect, with ministries of environment, and try to get the ministries of finance and the productive ministries in the countries, the transportation, the construction, and so on, involved in the decision in GEF programming and so on. So, because that will enhance the policy making at the country level based on what we do, what we find.
Thank you very much for thoroughly answering all the questions. And that brings us to the end of this session on evaluating for climate change adaptation, the critical challenge of the 21st century and beyond. I want to thank heartfully to all the participants and especially to all our panelists who have graciously shared their knowledge and experience in conducting evaluation for addressing this important planetary challenge. I want to thank you again and wish you a wonderful day, and we'll be in contact soon in another interesting session of this Asian Evaluation Week. Thank you very much for the organizers, and have a very good day. Good evening.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.